He thought no one in the room could understand him. And that was his first mistake. The chandelier light shimmered across crystal glasses as the private gala hummed with quiet power, deals worth hundreds of millions floating between polite smiles and measured handshakes, and at the center of it all stood Daniel Whitmore, the kind of billionaire who never needed to raise his voice to control a room, his tailored suit sharp, his watch worth more than most cars, his presence enough to make conversations pause when he stepped closer. And yet tonight, his attention wasn't on the investors or the negotiations but on something far smaller, or so he thought, a waitress moving silently between tables, her steps precise, her posture composed, her eyes observant without ever lingering too long. Emily Carter blended into the background like she was trained to disappear. Her black uniform simple, her hair neatly tied back, her expression neutral, almost unreadable, and no one questioned it because no one looked twice. Not in a room like this where status decided visibility. But Daniel noticed just enough to be annoyed. The way she adjusted a glass slightly before he reached for it. The way she replaced a document that had shifted half an inch on the table. The way she seemed to anticipate movements before they happened. It wasn't impressive, not to him, just unnecessary. And when one of his foreign partners leaned in, speaking quietly about final numbers, Daniel switched languages without hesitation. His Arabic smooth, controlled, deliberate, a language he used like a closed door, something only a few in the room could follow, something that gave him an edge, and then with the faintest smirk, he let a sentence slip, low enough to seem private, sharp enough to carry meaning, a comment about the invisible help, about how people like her existed only to serve and never to understand, and a couple of the men at the table exchanged knowing glances, one of them letting out a soft chuckle, the kind that never quite reached the surface, and across the table, Emily didn't react, not immediately, her hand steady as she poured water into a glass, the liquid catching the light, her face calm, almost distant, as if the words had passed right through her, and Daniel leaned back slightly satisfied, already shifting his focus back to the negotiation, unaware that something in the air had changed, not loudly, not dramatically but enough because Emily's eyes lifted for just a second, not toward him, but toward the reflection in the polished silver tray she held. And in that reflection, she watched him, measured him, and then quietly, almost imperceptibly, she set the tray down, adjusted the placement of a single document in front of him, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table, and stepped back into position, waiting, listening, and for the first time that evening the silence between words felt different, like something was about to be said that no one in that room was ready to hear. Daniel continued speaking in Arabic, his tone confident, controlled, as numbers and terms flowed effortlessly between him and the investors, but something subtle had shifted. The rhythm was no longer clean, no longer perfectly aligned, and he felt it before he understood it. A slight hesitation from one of the men across the table, a delayed response, a glance that lingered a second too long, as if something was not adding up. And then Emily moved again, silent, precise, placing a fresh glass near the lead investor but not directly in front of him, just slightly off-center, enough to draw his attention, enough to interrupt the flow for half a second. And in high-stakes negotiation, half a second was everything. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he recalibrated, continuing the conversation, but now watching more closely, and Emily remained exactly what she appeared to be, a waitress, quiet, efficient, invisible, except she was not really, because she was listening. Not just to the words but to the pauses between them, to the tone shifts, to the unspoken signals that most people missed. And when Daniel adjusted the contract on the table, sliding it forward with a confident motion, she was already there, one step ahead, aligning it again, her fingers brushing the edge just long enough to reveal a number that had not been mentioned aloud, a clause buried in the fine print. And across the table, the investor's eyes flickered down, catching it, his expression changing just slightly, curiosity replacing certainty. Daniel noticed that too, of course he did, he noticed everything, but now he could not trace the source, could not identify why the control he always held so tightly was beginning to slip, and for the first time that evening, he looked directly at her, really looked, not as part of the background, but as a variable he had not accounted for. And Emily met his gaze for just a fraction of a second, calm, steady, unreadable, before looking away as if nothing had happened. And that was what unsettled him most, not defiance, not arrogance, but the complete absence of either, as if she did not need to prove anything at all, as if she already knew something he did not. And the conversation continued. But now there was tension beneath it, invisible to most but undeniable to those who understood power, and then Daniel made a choice, a small one but deliberate. He shifted back into Arabic, his voice lower now, sharper, testing, pushing, and this time his words carried a different edge, not just dismissal but challenge, as if daring the room itself to respond, and Emily stood there, just within reach, hands folded neatly in front of her, listening, always listening, and the silence that followed his sentence stretched just a little too long until finally she moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but with quiet certainty, stepping forward, her voice soft enough to remain controlled, yet clear enough that every person at that table could hear, and when she spoke it was not in English. The first word left her lips in flawless Arabic, soft but precise, and the effect was immediate, the kind of silence that did not need to be commanded. It simply arrived, settling over the table as every conversation nearby seemed to fade into the background, and Daniel did not move, not at first, because his mind was still catching up to what his ears had just heard. The pronunciation was exact, not just correct but native, the rhythm natural, the tone controlled, and then she continued, not raising her voice, not seeking attention but correcting him, not only the sentence he had spoken, but the meaning behind it, unraveling the insult with calm clarity, and then without pause she shifted, her words moving seamlessly into the language of business, pointing out a discrepancy in the contract, a detail that had not been mentioned, a condition buried deep enough that it could have cost millions, and across the table, the lead investor straightened, his expression sharpening as he processed what she had said, his fingers slowly closing over the edge of the document as he reread the clause she had just exposed, and Daniel felt it then, unmistakable, the shift of control leaving his hands, not violently, not dramatically, but quietly, the way power often moved when it was real, and for the first time in years, he had no immediate response, no calculated reply ready to deploy, because this had not been part of the equation. She had not been part of the equation, and yet here she was, standing beside the table as if she had always belonged there, her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged, as though speaking in that language in that context was nothing out of the ordinary, and one of the investors let out a low breath, almost a laugh but not quite, more disbelief than amusement, as he responded to her in Arabic, testing, probing, and she answered without hesitation, her reply sharper now, more precise and undeniably informed, and that was when the realization spread. Not all at once, but like a ripple through the room. People were watching now, not openly, not obviously, but enough to feel the shift in attention, enough to sense that something unusual was happening at a table that had been expected to proceed without interruption. And Daniel finally spoke, switching back to English, his voice steady but lower than before, asking her a question that was not really a question, more a demand for explanation. And Emily met his gaze again, just briefly, her eyes calm, almost detached, before she answered, still composed, still professional, but no longer invisible, and in that moment, the room understood something he had not yet fully accepted, that the quietest person at the table had just changed the outcome of the entire negotiation without ever raising her voice. Daniel did not like variables he could not control, and right now, Emily Carter stood in front of him as something far more dangerous than a mistake. She was an unknown he had already underestimated, and that realization settled in slowly, tightening his expression just enough that those closest to him could see it, the faint shift in his posture, the way his fingers paused against the edge of the table, but his voice, when he spoke again, remained composed, measured, almost casual, as if the moment had not unsettled him at all. Yet the question he asked carried weight. Not loud, not aggressive, but deliberate, asking where she had learned to speak like that, why she understood details that were never spoken aloud, and Emily did not rush to answer. She adjusted a glass first, aligning it with quiet precision, then lifted her gaze, calm, steady, meeting his without hesitation, and when she spoke, it was in English now, soft, controlled, and unmistakably clear. She said that language was not difficult when people listened carefully, and business was not complicated when people paid attention to what others tried to hide, and there was no arrogance in her tone, no challenge, just a simple statement that landed heavier than any accusation could have. And across the table, the lead investor leaned back slightly, studying her with open curiosity now, no longer pretending not to notice, and then he asked her something directly, again in Arabic, testing her, pushing further, and she answered without pause, her words flowing with the same precision. But this time she did more than translate, she clarified, she broke down the structure of the agreement, pointed out the imbalance in terms, and suggested an adjustment that would protect both sides. And it was subtle but powerful, the kind of insight that did not just come from language but from experience. And that was when the room shifted again, deeper this time, because this was no longer about surprise. This was about recognition, and Daniel saw it, the way attention moved toward her. The way influence followed understanding, and for the first time that evening, he was not the center of it, and that, more than anything, forced him to reconsider, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her, not dismissively now, but carefully, searching for something he had missed, something that explained how a waitress in a simple uniform could stand in a room like this and speak with the confidence of someone who belonged, and Emily, sensing the shift without looking for it, stepped back, slightly, returning to her position as if nothing had changed, as if she had not just redirected the entire conversation. And that was the detail that stayed with him, not what she said, not even how she said it, but how easily she stepped away from it, leaving the impact behind without claiming it. And Daniel realized then, with a clarity he could not ignore, that the most dangerous person in the room was not the one with the most power, but the one who did not need to prove they had it at all. The conversation did not return to what it had been before, not completely, because once something invisible becomes visible, it cannot disappear again, and Daniel felt that shift settling deeper into the room, subtle but undeniable, as the investors now spoke with a different tone, more cautious, more deliberate, their questions sharper, their attention no longer anchored to him alone, and each time one of them glanced toward Emily, even briefly, it reinforced the imbalance he could not ignore. Yet he adapted, because that was what he did best. He adjusted, recalculated, and continued, guiding the discussion forward with the same composed authority, but now with an awareness he had not needed before. And as the negotiation resumed, the lead investor spoke again in Arabic, slower this time, more intentional, outlining a revised structure, one that directly addressed the flaw Emily had revealed, and Daniel listened, his expression neutral, but his mind moving quickly, recognizing that the leverage he had quietly built into the deal was slipping away, not because it had been exposed publicly, but because it had been understood, and understanding changed everything. And then, almost instinctively, he turned slightly toward Emily, not fully, just enough to acknowledge her presence without making it obvious, and asked a follow-up question, still in Arabic, testing once more. But this time the tone had changed. There was no mockery, no dismissal, only precision, and Emily answered again, just as calmly, her voice steady, offering clarification without overstepping, guiding the interpretation without taking control. And it was that restraint that solidified her position, not dominance, not force, but quiet authority. And across the table, the investors began directing questions toward her as well, not formally, not directly, but enough that the dynamic was undeniable, and Daniel allowed it, because stopping it would reveal too much, and he did not lose control. Openly, not in a room like this, but internally, something had shifted, a recognition that this was no longer a simple transaction. It had become a balance of perception, of credibility, and Emily, without ever claiming a seat at the table, had earned both. And as the final terms began to settle, cleaner now, more transparent, the kind that could be agreed upon without hidden conditions, Daniel leaned back slightly, watching her again, not as an interruption, not as an inconvenience, but as something far more complex, and for a brief moment, their eyes met once more, and this time there was no dismissal in his gaze, only calculation, curiosity, and something else he rarely allowed himself to feel, respect. And Emily, as before, did not react. She simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a truth that did not need to be spoken, and then stepped away, returning to the quiet rhythm of her work, leaving behind a table where the deal had changed, the power had shifted, and the man who once controlled everything was now forced to reconsider the one person he had never thought to notice. By the time the final terms were spoken, the deal had transformed into something cleaner, sharper, stripped of the quiet advantages Daniel had originally built into it, and the investors seemed satisfied, their nods measured, their tone no longer cautious but resolved, and one by one, signatures followed, pens gliding across thick paper under the glow of chandelier light, sealing an agreement that, on the surface, looked successful. But to Daniel it felt different, not a loss, not exactly, but not a victory either. And as the documents were collected and the tension in the room softened into polite conversation, the focus shifted outward again, glasses refilled, chairs adjusted, voices rising just slightly as the formality eased. Yet Daniel remained still for a moment longer, his gaze not on the papers, not on the investors, but on the space where Emily had been standing, now empty, as if nothing unusual had ever happened there. And that absence lingered more than her presence had. because it left him with something unresolved, a question he could not ignore, and finally, he stood, offering the appropriate handshakes, the practiced smile returning, controlled, effortless, the version of himself everyone expected, and yet behind that composure, his attention moved elsewhere, scanning the room with quiet precision until he found her again across the floor, carrying a tray, speaking softly to another guest, her movements unchanged, her demeanor exactly as before, as if she had not just altered the course of a multimillion-dollar negotiation, and that contrast unsettled him more than anything she had said, because it meant she had not been performing, had not been trying to impress or prove anything, she had simply acted, and then returned to being unseen, and Daniel began walking, not directly toward her, not yet, but in that direction, his pace unhurried, his expression neutral, giving no indication of intent, and along the way, a few guests stopped him, offering congratulations, brief comments on the deal, but his responses were shorter now, more automatic, his focus divided, until finally, he stood just a few feet away from her, close enough to observe, without interrupting, and he noticed details he had overlooked before, the steadiness of her hands, the way she listened fully when someone spoke to her, the absence of hesitation in even the smallest movement, and it confirmed what he had begun to understand, that her presence in that moment earlier had not been an accident, and when she turned, sensing him without surprise, their eyes met again, and this time, there was no distance in it, no hierarchy, just a quiet acknowledgement, and Daniel spoke, not as a command, not as a test, but as a genuine question, asking her name as if it mattered now, and Emily answered simply, without emphasis, without expectation, and the way she said it made it clear that she did not need the room to remember her, because she already understood something deeper, that being underestimated had never been her disadvantage, it had always been her advantage. Her name settled between them without weight, without expectation, as if it did not need to carry anything more than it already did, and Daniel repeated it once, quietly, testing the sound of it in a way he rarely allowed himself to do, because names to him had always been identifiers, labels attached to roles, to positions, to value, but this felt different, not because of the name itself, but because of what he now associated with it. And Emily did not linger in the moment, she simply inclined her head slightly, professional, composed, ready to move on, as if the conversation had already reached its natural end. But Daniel was not finished, not yet, and that alone marked a shift, because he was not used to seeking continuation, not when he had already received what he needed, yet here he was asking another question, this time more direct, not about language, not about the deal, but about her, where she had learned to navigate. Both with such precision, and Emily paused, just briefly, not out of hesitation but consideration, as if deciding how much to say, and when she answered, her voice remained even steady. She said that she had listened more than most people spoke, and that over time, people revealed everything if you paid attention long enough, and there was something in that answer that made Daniel narrow his eyes slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition, because it mirrored something he understood, something he had built his own success on, yet he had never considered it from her side of the room, never from a position that was meant to be overlooked, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the noise of the gala filling the space between them, glasses clinking, distant laughter, the soft hum of conversations that continued without awareness of what had just unfolded in a quiet corner. And then Daniel did something unexpected, even to himself. He thanked her, not casually, not as a formality, but with intention, acknowledging what she had done without diminishing it. And Emily's expression did not change much, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, something softer, not quite approval, not quite surprise, just an acknowledgement returned. And she replied simply that she had only corrected what was already there, nothing more, and that response stayed with him because it reframed everything. She had not added value, she had revealed it, and as she stepped past him to attend to another table, the movement smooth, uninterrupted, Daniel turned slightly, watching her go, not out of curiosity now but out of understanding, and for the first time that evening he was not thinking about the deal or the numbers or the outcome, he was thinking about perspective, about how easily it could be limited by assumption, and how costly that limitation could become. And across the room, one of the investors caught his eye, offering a nod of approval, a silent recognition that the negotiation had been handled well, and Daniel returned the gesture, his expression composed as always, but there was something different beneath it, something quieter, more reflective, and as he reached for his glass, he realized that the most valuable shift of the night had not been written into any contract. It had happened in a moment he almost missed, delivered by someone he almost ignored, and that realization, more than anything else, was what stayed with him as the evening moved forward. The night continued, but for Daniel, it no longer felt the same. The music still played, the conversation still flowed, and the room still shimmered with wealth and influence, yet something beneath it all had shifted, subtle but permanent, and he found himself noticing details he would have ignored before: the pauses in conversation, the way people chose their words, the quiet exchanges that carried more weight than the louder ones, and more than once, his attention returned to Emily, not directly, not obviously, but enough to track her presence across the room. The way she moved between tables with the same calm precision, never rushing, never hesitating, as if time itself adjusted to her rhythm, and each interaction she had was the same, respectful, attentive, but never excessive. She did not try to impress, did not seek approval, and yet people responded to her differently. They listened, even if they did not realize they were doing it. And Daniel began to understand why. It was not what she said, it was how she existed within the space, grounded, aware, untouched by the pressure that shaped everyone else in the room, and that realization pulled him deeper into thought, because it stood in contrast to everything he had built. His world was driven by control, by anticipation, by staying 3 steps ahead, but Emily operated differently. She did not control the room, she understood it, and there was a difference, a significant one. And as the evening moved toward its later hours, the crowd began to thin slightly, conversations breaking into smaller groups, the intensity softening, and Daniel found himself stepping away from the center for the first time that night, moving toward the edge of the room where the noise was quieter, where observation was easier, and from there, he watched again, not just her, but everything: the dynamics, the patterns, the unspoken hierarchy that governed interactions, and slowly, a realization formed, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, that he had been overlooking more than just one person. He had been overlooking an entire layer of understanding, one that did not rely on status or visibility but on awareness. And that was when Emily passed by again, close enough that he could speak if he chose to, but he did not this time. Instead, he simply observed as she paused briefly to adjust a detail on a nearby table, her movements as deliberate as ever, and then continued on, unaware or perhaps simply unconcerned with his presence. And for the first time, Daniel did not feel the need to interrupt, did not feel the need to test or question, because he already knew the answer to what mattered most: that she was not what she appeared to be, and more importantly, that she did not need to prove it to anyone. And as he stood there, the weight of that understanding settled in, quiet but undeniable, changing not just how he saw her, but how he began to see everything else around him. It was not a single moment that changed Daniel, but a series of small realizations that refused to be ignored. And as the gala moved into its final hours, those realizations began to settle into something more defined, more uncomfortable, because they challenged a pattern he had relied on for years: the assumption that control came from being seen, from being heard, from being the one others adjusted to. Yet tonight had shown him something quieter, something he could not dominate in the same way. And as he stood near the edge of the room, his attention once again found Emily, not because she demanded it, but because she never did, and that absence of demand created its own gravity, drawing attention without effort. And this time, he noticed something new, not in her, but in the people around her: the way a guest paused slightly longer when she spoke, the way another adjusted his tone to match her calm, the way even the most distracted conversations seemed to settle when she stepped into them. And it was subtle, almost invisible, but undeniable once seen. And Daniel realized that influence did not always announce itself, sometimes it simply aligned the room, and that understanding lingered as he watched her finish a quiet exchange with an older investor, her posture respectful but never diminished, her presence balanced in a way that did not seek approval yet received it anyway. And when she moved on, the conversation she left behind seemed clearer, more grounded, as if something had been quietly corrected. And Daniel exhaled slowly, not out of tension but recognition, because he had spent years building strategies to shape outcomes, to predict behavior, to stay ahead of every possible shift. Yet she had done something similar without strategy, without visible effort, simply by understanding what others missed, and that difference stayed with him, pressing against the certainty he had always carried. And after a moment, he stepped forward, not toward her directly, but into the space she had just left, as if trying to understand it from within. And for a brief second, he saw it differently, not as a stage to control, but as a system to read, to listen to move within rather than above. And when Emily passed by again, close enough that their paths nearly crossed, he spoke her name, not loudly, not to command attention, but just enough for her to hear, and she stopped, turning with the same calm awareness she had shown all evening, and Daniel looked at her, not as a mystery now, but as a mirror of something he had overlooked, and he asked one final question, not about language, not about business, but about perspective, asking how she always seemed to know what others were about to miss, and Emily considered him for a moment, her gaze steady, thoughtful. And then she answered in a way that did not sound like advice but like truth. She said that most people listen to respond, but very few listen to understand, and when you learned the difference you did not need to control the room anymore because the room revealed itself to you, and with that, she gave a small nod, the same quiet acknowledgement she had given before, and continued on her way, leaving Daniel standing there, not with a loss, not with a victory, but with something far more lasting, a shift in how he saw the world around him, and more importantly, how he saw the people he had once chosen not to notice. The answer did not leave him quickly, it stayed, echoing in a way that numbers and contracts never did, and as Emily disappeared back into the quiet rhythm of her work, Daniel remained where he was, still composed on the outside, but internally shifting, adjusting, reevaluating something far more foundational than any business strategy, because what she had said was not complicated, it was not technical. And yet it unsettled him more than any complex negotiation ever had. And slowly, almost instinctively, he began to test it, not with words but with attention, turning his focus outward again, but differently this time, not scanning for advantage, not calculating leverage, but simply observing, listening without preparing a response, and the change was immediate, subtle but undeniable. Conversations that once felt predictable now revealed layers he had ignored. Pauses that once seemed insignificant now carried meaning, and people, the same people he had dealt with for years, appeared slightly different, as if he was seeing them without the filter of expectation for the first time. And across the room, one of the investors spoke with another guest, his tone polite, but there was a hesitation beneath it, a slight uncertainty Daniel had never noticed before, and nearby, a quiet exchange between two executives carried more tension than their smiles suggested. And it became clear, almost uncomfortably so, that he had been moving through rooms like this with only part of the picture, relying on control to fill in the gaps he had never taken the time to understand, and that realization did not weaken him, but it changed the ground beneath him, and when he finally moved again, it was with a different kind of awareness, not louder, not more assertive, but more precise, more intentional, and as he rejoined a conversation near the center of the room, he did not lead it immediately, did not redirect it toward his own agenda. He listened first, allowing the flow to reveal itself, and when he spoke it was measured, aligned with what had already been said rather than imposed upon it, and the effect was immediate. The conversation settled more quickly, agreement reached with less resistance, and Daniel recognized it then, not as coincidence but as confirmation that understanding carried its own form of control, quieter, but far more effective, and as the evening began to draw to a close, guests preparing to leave, coats retrieved, final words exchanged, Daniel found himself once again looking for Emily, not out of curiosity, not even out of respect alone, but because she had become a reference point for something he had just begun to grasp. And when he saw her near the exit, speaking softly to a departing guest, he did not interrupt, he simply watched for a moment, long enough to understand that what she carried was not something that needed recognition to exist, and when she finished and turned, their eyes met one last time, and there was no need for words, no need for acknowledgement beyond that brief connection, because the shift had already happened, not just in how he saw her, but in how he would see every room he walked into from that moment on. The doors began to open more frequently now, the quiet signal that the night was ending, and one by one, the most powerful people in the room stepped out into the cool air, their conversations fading into the distance, their deals already shifting into memory. But Daniel did not leave immediately. He remained just inside the threshold, still, composed, watching the final moments unfold with a clarity he had not carried into the evening. And it was strange, not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar. Because for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what came next, not calculating his next move, not preparing for the next negotiation. He was simply present, observing the way the staff moved more freely now, the way the pressure lifted from their shoulders as the room emptied, and among them, Emily moved the same as before, unchanged, steady, as if the entire night had not altered her pace at all, And that consistency held his attention more than anything else, because it confirmed what he had begun to understand, that her strength did not come from moments like earlier, it came from something constant, something she carried into every moment without needing recognition. And as the last of the investors exited, Daniel finally stepped forward, not with urgency, not with intention to interrupt, but with a quiet decision forming beneath the surface. And when Emily approached to clear the final table near the entrance, he spoke again, not to test, not to challenge, but to offer something, though even he had not fully decided what that something was. And when she turned, meeting his gaze with the same calm awareness, he paused for just a fraction longer than expected, because this was not a negotiation, there was no structure to rely on, no outcome to secure, and that alone made it different. And finally he spoke, asking if she had ever considered doing something else, something beyond this room, beyond the role everyone assumed she belonged to. And there was no condescension in his voice, no hidden meaning, just a genuine question shaped by everything he had learned in the past few hours. And Emily listened fully, as she always did, her expression unchanged, her posture relaxed, and when she answered it was simple, clear. She said that she already did more than most people noticed, and that was enough. And the words did not challenge him, did not reject him, they simply existed, grounded, certain, and Daniel understood them in a way he would not have before, not as limitation but as choice. And that realization settled in quietly, reshaping the offer he had almost made, turning it into something unnecessary. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them filled not with tension, but with understanding. And then Emily gave a small nod, the same quiet acknowledgement that had marked every turning point that evening, and stepped past him, continuing her work without hesitation, leaving Daniel standing there once more. But this time there was nothing unresolved, nothing left to question, because the lesson had already been given, not through instruction but through presence. And as he finally turned toward the exit, stepping out into the night, he carried with him something far more valuable than the deal he had signed, a shift in perspective that would follow him into every room he entered from that moment on. The night air was cooler than he expected, sharp against the quiet stillness outside. And as Daniel stepped away from the gala, the noise of the evening faded behind him, replaced by something far more unfamiliar, silence that was not empty, but full, carrying every moment he had just experienced in a way that refused to be ignored. And for once, he did not reach for his phone, did not call his assistant, did not review the deal he had just closed. Instead he stood there for a moment, looking back at the building, its lights still glowing, knowing that what had happened inside was not something that could be measured in numbers or outcomes. And slowly, he began to walk, his pace unhurried, his mind not racing ahead as it usually did, but moving through the details of the night, the small shifts, the pauses, the words that had not been said as much as the ones that had. And at the center of it all was Emily. Not as a distraction, not as an anomaly, but as a point of clarity, a moment where something he had long overlooked had become impossible to ignore. And with each step, that clarity settled deeper, not challenging his success, not diminishing it, but reshaping it, adding something he had not known he was missing. And when he reached his car, he paused again, his hand resting lightly on the door, and for the first time in years, he did not get in immediately. Instead, he looked up, the city stretching out in front of him, full of movement, full of noise, full of people, each carrying their own quiet presence that he had never truly taken the time to understand. And it struck him then, not as a revelation, but as a realization that had been waiting, that the rooms he had dominated for years had always held more than he allowed himself to see, and that power, real power, was not just about being heard, it was about knowing when to listen. And that understanding did not make him less, it made him sharper, more aware, more precise in ways that no strategy alone could achieve. And as he finally opened the car door and stepped inside, the familiar comfort of control returned, but it was different now, not rigid, not absolute, but balanced with something quieter, something steadier. And as the car began to move through the city streets, the reflections of lights passing across the window, Daniel did not close his eyes, did not disconnect as he usually would after a long evening. Instead, he watched, noticing details he would have ignored before, the rhythm of traffic, the subtle patterns of movement, the way people navigated space without speaking. And it felt strange at first, but not uncomfortable, more like learning a language he had always heard but never understood. And somewhere in that quiet observation, he realized that the most important part of the night was not the deal, not the outcome, not even the moment that had shifted everything. It was what came after, the choice to see differently, to listen differently, to move through the world with a deeper awareness of what existed beneath the surface. And as the car disappeared into the flow of the city, carrying him forward into the next chapter of his life, the lesson remained steady, quiet, and impossible to forget. The next morning arrived without announcement, just light slipping quietly through the glass walls of Daniel's office, casting long reflections across polished surfaces that had always represented control, precision, and certainty, and for years, that space had felt complete, every detail intentional, every decision calculated, but today, something in it felt different, not wrong, not unfamiliar, but incomplete in a way he had never noticed before, and as he stood there, looking out over the city from 30 floors above, the movement below no longer appeared as distant noise. It felt structured, layered, full of signals he had only just begun to recognize, and when his assistant entered with the morning briefing outlining meetings, projections, opportunities lined up with perfect efficiency, Daniel listened, but not in the same way he always had. He was not just hearing the information, he was paying attention to how it was delivered, the slight pause before certain numbers, the emphasis placed on specific details, and it became clear that even here in the environment he controlled most, there were layers he had overlooked, and when the briefing ended, he did something unexpected. He asked a question, not about profit, not about timelines, but about context, about what had not been said directly, and his assistant hesitated for a moment, surprised, then answered, and in that moment Daniel saw it again, the difference between hearing and understanding, and it confirmed what he had carried from the night before, that awareness was not limited to a single room, it applied everywhere, and as the day unfolded, meeting after meeting, conversation after conversation, he tested it, not openly, not dramatically, but consistently, listening first, observing more, speaking with intention rather than assumption, and the results were immediate, subtle, but undeniable. Discussions moved more efficiently, resistance appeared earlier, easier to address, and decisions felt clearer, not because they were simpler, but because he was finally seeing the full picture, and somewhere between those moments Emily's presence remained, not as a memory, but as a reference point, a quiet standard that reshaped how he measured understanding, and by the time the afternoon light shifted across the room, Daniel realized something that did not require analysis, did not need confirmation. It was simply true, that the most important lesson he had learned had not come from a boardroom, not from a mentor, not from years of experience. It had come from a moment he almost dismissed, delivered by someone he almost ignored, and that truth settled in without resistance, grounding itself in a way that would not fade with time. And as he looked out over the city once more, no longer from a place of distance, but from a place of awareness, the quiet moral of the night became clear, not spoken, not announced, but understood, that the people the world overlooks are often the ones who see it most clearly, and those who learn to listen to them do not lose control, they gain something far greater.